Good afternoon, everyone. I'm certainly excited to be here. It was quite the welcoming yesterday. That storm really made me feel at home. I've always heard about the North Dakota storms, and it is no joke, but it is certainly similar. A little bit about this topic of managing grasslands into the future. I'm very excited about it. It's also very daunting, and it makes me uncomfortable. The reason I'm excited is we're able to talk about and dwell about what's possible and where we can take this and what's necessary. And the reason that it's daunting and uncomfortable and maybe even makes me a little squeamish is because of what's at stake if we don't get it right or right enough. And all that to say, I'm very honored to be up here in front of you today, and you know, it's not my first nature to be standing in front of a microphone talking to a crowd. I'm an introvert, like all of us ranchers in the room. This isn't exactly what I would choose to do, but I also feel that it's my responsibility to do it because it is so exciting and promising what we've been discovering at the ranch and what we've seen to be possible, or at least where we are in our thought process on how things can be done. And so I'm honored to share that with you here today. So Stephen Livestock Company is Daryl said, is my family's ranch. I'm part of the 5th generation. I manage operations, and it's located in the Big Belt Mountains of Montana, which is between Helen and Great Falls. We range from 4,200 to 7,800 feet in elevation. As Daryl said, it was founded by my great-great-grandfather, Henry Sieben, whose family immigrated from Germany when he was 2. And when he walked out with that wagon train, he was 17 years old. He was basically an orphan. And he landed in the Gallatin Valley of Montana and had started out freighting and sold old used up oxen to mining camps as beef, and that's how he became a rancher, got into the free range. Well, that all happened during the free range days, and every fall roundup he'd go and he'd look for his critters, and he'd find them in the same spot every single year, and he told himself that if he could ever afford a ranch, that's where he wanted it to be because the cattle chose it. And that was the last ranch that he purchased in his career, which became Sieben Livestock Company, and that was the ranch that he gifted to my great-grandmother who married a Hibbard, and so that's how that family tree works. So Henry Sieben is here on the left, and it was, as Daryl said, primarily a sheep ranch through both world wars, and then we transitioned to mostly beef cattle in the 1960s, and we've had a band of sheep basically until 2008, and now we just run 100 ewes or so, and I hope to grow that to about 400. And then this is Henry and my great-grandmother Margaret and my granddad Hank. And so I'm just going to talk a little bit about my why and Sieben Livestock Company's, how it lays out, just to paint the context of what we do and why certain things work and maybe don't, so you can keep that in the back of your mind. It's certainly not all apples to apples. And then I'll talk about our progression of grazing. I'll talk about our genetics and what we've been seeing as working for us. And so my why, it's been instilled in me from my family to have a very strong land ethic, and that's what drives me. For me, this is what it's all about right here. This place has a soul, and it wants to breathe. And I believe it's incumbent upon us as stewards to allow it to do so to the best of its capacity and to the best of our capacity. So that's number one. Number two, I understood at a young age. Well, I came home in 2013, back to the ranch, and I understood shortly after getting to the ranch that the number one thing, I knew what I wanted to do from a very young age. Once I was 12, I knew what I wanted to do, and I started to craft my life with that intent of studying how can I carry this ranch forward. What things do I need to learn? What things do I need to be exposed to take on that responsibility and hopefully bring it to the 6th generation? And I understood recently, well, shortly after coming home in 2013, that one of the biggest metrics for whether or not I was successful in my career was if my family's ranch was something that was exciting and thriving and financially viable and magnetic, that if the 6th generation so chose, it was there for them. So all of us ranchers and farmers in the room, we all have a driving purpose, and it's all probably very similar to mine, if not the exact same. But that's what gets me out the door every morning, and that's what all of what I'm going to be sharing with you today is the result of making some serious mistakes and failures. And this is what keeps me, all of us, picking ourselves up off the ground and trying it again. And so, as a 5th generation coming home, it wasn't exactly a rosy picture if what you're wanting to do is to carry on the family's ranch to the 6th generation. So the best data that I could find from USDA was from 2008 to 2018, and of course I'm sure it's more bleak now, is that commodity prices, what we were receiving in the cow-calf model, had basically stayed stagnant. It had remained flat, yet input costs had risen approximately 40%. So that's financial pressure. And yet the climate is also changing. We have a weather station at the ranch from 1980 to 2000. Our average annual precipitation was nearly 22 inches. And from 2000 to present day, it's 16 inches. So that's a completely different environment. That's environmental pressure. And so the message to the younger generation coming home wanting to carry this forward is you have to produce more with less, pay more to do it, and under more variable circumstances. So how the heck do you crack that nut? That's pretty tough. And I came to realize that it was all about building resiliency into the system. And this is through being exposed to Alan Savory and holistic management and Gabe Brown and all these amazing people who've been pioneers. Johann Zeitzman is a real hero of mine. It's about building resiliency financially through increased stocking rate, which is our ability to generate revenue. That's the number one profit driver as a rancher. How many critters you can run sustainably within your boundaries, your borders, year-round. It's also in building soil and increasing forage productivity. That's how we build the capacity to increase our stocking rate and to deal with these punches that Mother Nature inevitably is going to throw at us. And then socially, it's about empowering our people to give them a sense of purpose and to want to be there. So how do you do that? What's the common denominator? And for me, I believe that it's grazing. Grazing pulls all of that together. And so grazing management progression at Sieben Livestock Company was my Uncle Chase took the helm in 1976 after my grandfather died unexpectedly in a plane crash. And in the early 1980s, he implemented what's called the Gus Hormé restoration system, which has since, in the early 1990s, been adopted by Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks and all of their public-private lease exchanges is the golden standard. And basically what the Gus Hormé restoration system is, it's a 3-year system. First year, pasture number 1 would be graze season long. That's the original interpretation. Year 2 is graze post-seed ripe, so after July 15th, July 25th in our environment. Year 3, you don't touch it. And then year 4, it repeats itself. And so it's been proven by science time and again to improve your land base, improve your resources, decrease bare soil, improve grass species composition. And really the reason that works is because that there's 2 growing season rests out of every 3 years. That's the reason that formula, that system works. So if you're doing continuous or season-long grazing and you want to start someplace, this is the easiest place to start by adopting this. I would just modify, instead of graze season-long, in like early 2000s, we changed that to graze during the growing season. So you graze it, that's an early season graze. That's the easiest thing that you can do. And then in 2005, my family was introduced to holistic management and ranching for profit, and they were influenced by those philosophies, and we put management groups together. We ran them in higher densities with faster moves, and then from 2010 to 2015, we began to implement the graze tall method, which is basically graze a third, leave 2/3, move really fast, shorten your rest periods. And then in 2016, I was exposed to Johann Zeitzman and non-selective grazing, and I became a big believer in that immediately. And so in 2016, we started implementing non-selective grazing when feasible underneath the Gus Hormé rest rotation umbrella, specifically that point of do not graze a pasture during the growing season. Only graze a pasture during the growing season once out of every 3 years. And so by doing that, we non-selectively graze, and then we follow with a long period of rest. And just to give you a little context of what Sebring livestock is like, the lay of the land, as I said, we go from 4,200 to 7,800 feet in elevation. And it basically breaks the ranch up into 3 zones. At the bottom is the winter zone, and then we have a transition zone, and then our summer zone. And our summer is, if you're to map all that out, the amount of grass that we have in each of those levels, it'd be like this inverse pyramid. The winter zone is the bottleneck, and not only is it the least amount of ground and the least amount of grass that we have, it's also we have to be there 5 to 6 months out of the year. So that was our stocking rate bottleneck, and stocking rate being the #1 driver of profitability, that's where our focus had to be. And so in 2000, my Uncle Chase and my Uncle Whit and my dad and the ranch team at the time decided to make the big leap from calving in February and March to calving in June to better match the cow's production cycle, not only with the natural grass cycle of our environment, but to also better match that inverse pyramid that I was talking about. And what that did was that allowed us to begin to graze our cows through the winter, because our cows were in their 2nd and 3rd trimester. So it was their lowest nutritional demands of their whole production cycle. And when I came home in 2013, this is the heart of our winter grazing zone. It's 5 sections. Average graze period was 7 days. There was 13 paddocks. And then the next year, average graze period, we ramped it up to 4.5 days. And then it was 2 days. And then in 2016, we were exposed to non-selective grazing. And by 2018, it was 83 temporary paddocks. And then in 2020, we're at 150 plus of temporary paddocks throughout the winter. And so non-selective grazing, basically the tenets behind non-selective grazing are to affect every single plant. And when you do that, you put every plant on a level playing field. And when every plant's on a level playing field, the plants with the deepest root systems and the most amount of leaf area are the plants that outcompete if given a proper amount of rest. And by definition, those are your desirable species. For us, that's our rough fescues, our green needlegrass. Those are our pinnacle species. And a byproduct of doing that, well, first, in order to do that and not compromise animal performance, you have to do it in a short period of time. And so by doing it in a short period of time, your densities, and to have it be non-selective grazing, then your densities have to be really tight. And so a byproduct of non-selective grazing is you have a high trampling effect. You lay down a lot of litter, because whatever plant is not grazed is trampled. And because of that density, the litter that is laid down, this is something that we don't really talk about in grazing circles that I think should be, the litter that is laid down is actually pressed into the soil, so it kickstarts the decomposition process. All the nutrients from that organic matter goes to the soil instead of if it's like laying on top of the soil, it'll oxidize and most of it will return into the atmosphere and not really do you any good. And also by doing that, we cover the soil. By covering the soil, we moderate the temperature, we extend the growing season. We're effectively selecting for our desirable species. Our desirable species also have a longer growing season. They maintain their green longer. They have a less erratic production cycle during droughts. They're a little bit more constant, so that's your resiliency. And they're higher quality, right? Whereas before non-selective grazing was implemented at Sieben Livestock Company, we were doing this graze-tall method, which is essentially selective grazing, the exact opposite. And so what happens in that scenario is cows get moved into a pasture. They go around and all they do is eat the ice cream, which are your desirable species. They don't touch your undesirables, and so your undesirables have a leg up in that situation. They're the ones who are left to propagate. So you're effectively selecting for your undesirable species. Not only that, in order to do that well, you shorten your rest periods, which is essentially what we saw in that 5-year time span at Sieben Livestock. However, the downside to non-selective grazing and the thing to go in with your eyes wide open, which we'll talk about more here, is animal performance is very, very technical. In order to do that right, it's hard. It's really hard. And so this is the first experiment that we did with non-selective grazing. And that's my boss, Uncle Chase, coming out to check out this crazy new thing that we're doing and make sure we aren't totally screwing everything up. So he's standing on the graze line. There's a temporary fence there. On the right was a 1-day graze, high density, non-selective. On the left was a 2.5-day graze. You wouldn't think there would be that big of a difference. But it wasn't non-selective. We were there for 2.5 days, and we had to leave because it was just time to go, animal behavior-wise. And so we're checking it out. Immediately after taking this photo, I turned the camera down, and this is what the ground looked like. Zero bare soil. You can see how much litter is trampled into the ground. You can see the manure splattered and trampled into the ground. And this is 3 weeks later. That's that same fence line. And those dark green, really vibrant plants, those bunch grasses, that's our rough fescue. That's our pinnacle species. So that's telling us, Mother Nature's telling us this is what she likes. Do this again. Now I'll preface this with, what needs to be underlined is that there is an adequate amount of rest in this pasture before we went in and we grazed it like this. There's enough root reserves for these plants to respond as they did. And what doesn't, you can kind of see it. See kind of on that upper left-hand corner, there's a big patch of kind of whitish grayish grass. That's cheatgrass. On the right side, we didn't see nearly as much of that. Our annual species do not like this type of a grazing treatment. There's too much mulch on the ground. And this is at full recovery, same pasture. Again, here's a fence line. This is a laneway to a water tank on the right. And even though it's greener on the left, that green is actually Canadian thistle, not any Canadian thistle on the right. So in 7 years, by doing non-selective grazing, we've improved our forage harvest and production rate by 200% in the winter zone, and by 200% in the transition zone, and 110% in the summer zone. So this is just that mapped out. That's on average. And the most drastic example that we have is this pasture called Lower 23, where the historical harvest rate was 16 CDAs. CDAs is cow days per acre, which is what we use to measure the volume of forage, which means that that pasture could support 16 cows. 1 acre could support 16 cows for 1 day. In 2016, it was 39. That's when we first started non-selective grazing. 2018, it was 93 CDAs, which is a 485% increase over the historical average. And then in 2021, it was 125 CDAs, which is a 680% increase over the historical average. And to just communicate how big of a deal that is, that all happened in the driest years in the history of the ranch. Last decade was the driest in the history of the ranch. You know, I said from 2000 to present day, average rainfall is 16 inches. Well, everything in red there is either at 16 inches or below. This photo I took last May, about May 15th. This is taking what we call our mob out to grass. It's all 3-year-olds and up. The amount of dust there is that's not what you want to see in mid-May. It was dry. It was very dry. And so the cards are stacked against us, and yet we're growing more with less, strictly through changing grazing management. And a different way to iterate how big of a deal increasing our winter zone capacity by 200% is essentially for the price of changing our grazing management and the price of sticking our neck out and trying these experiments. One thing I didn't mention is one of our mottos, which we've taken from Bert Teichert, is fail fast, fail cheap, fail forward. So if there's anything that we're interested in, like non-selective grazing, it's set up an experiment where if you fail, it's fast, it's cheap, it doesn't cost you anything, or you're out very little, and you're better off because of it, because of what you learn from it. So we've embodied that wholeheartedly, and every single little thing that we do is we try to adhere to that principle. But essentially, by changing our grazing management and doing non-selective grazing, we've been handed 2 more winter zones. If you remember that inverse pyramid, our winter country is no longer the bottleneck for our stocking rate. We don't know what our stocking rate is. We don't know what our stocking capacity is currently. I don't know how many cows we can run. And we're at the end of a long dirt road, so in order for us to buy hay, we have to pay $30 extra per ton over market value. And so this year it'd actually be over $300 a ton if we were to buy hay. So this, by grazing our cows out over the winter on these one-day moves, we've essentially saved opportunity costs $530 a head as opposed to having to feed them this winter. Another pretty neat thing, so that the average county stocking rate for Cascade County in Montana is 26 acres per cow in order to run a cow year round. If we were to extrapolate what we're doing in our winter zone with our cows and then like prorate it for when they have a calf and all their other nutritional needs and take that year round, it would take us 4.2 acres to run 1 cow for a year, which is 6 times the county average, 6 times less, I suppose. And then 2021 was the driest and hottest year in everyone's memory and on our records. And most of our neighbors had to destock 20 to 40% that fall. The herd in our winter grazing zone was 26% bigger than it was the year before. And we continued to beat our harvest rate records, which is our indicator for forage productivity, while we increased body condition without supplement. And so this proves to us that how we've been grazing and the genetics that we've been selecting for are working. So in 2021, we wintered 1,030 cows on 200 pounds of hay per head and 0 supplement. And in 2022, we wintered 1,300 cows on 330 pounds of hay per head and 0 supplement. And from December to April, we had 2 outside sources, a nutritionist and an NRCS agent we've been working with for quite some time, rate their body condition score in both December and April. And both years in a row, 2021 and 2022, they gained 3/4 of a body condition, which is the equivalent of roughly 75 pounds, which from that time period, December to April, would be the equivalent of gaining 2/3 of a pound per head per day. And the nutritionist that I mentioned, Dr. Sager, he was a cattle vet for 40 years and he retired when he was 65 and went and got his doctorate in ruminant nutrition. He's seen a lot of cattle, and he said that first season, 2021, after he scored them in April, that he did not think that that was possible. He said it blew everything out of the water. So how did we do that? What are the principles that we're doing? For animal performance, we want our cows to see fresh feed as frequently as possible. And so for us, for our mob, which in the winter is our 4-year-olds and up, that's every day. Every day we're giving them a new graze. And this last winter we did an experiment with our coming 2 and coming 3-year-olds in a group on supplement, where we winter graze them out for about 6 weeks. And then this winter we've been grazing them out for we hope to do it for about 3.5 months on supplement, a high energy, high protein supplement. We're moving them anywhere from 1 to 4 times a day, depending on what they need and what's feasible. We don't want to take the fun out of it. It shouldn't just be work, right? That's huge. The biggest key that we've found for making this possible, aside from genetics, which we'll get into, is moving them when they're full. So that this real competitive, frenetic mob mentality that you hear about with mob grazing is very real. I've seen it. I've been a part of it a lot. It's not fun. It's super stressful for cattle and people. Makes you feel very uneasy at night. Makes you feel very uneasy. You know exactly when you show up how you can feel it in your gut, and you get that sinking sensation that things aren't right. Well, that competitive, frenetic energy, you can take that and use it as a tool to your own benefit. And what we're doing is, while cattle are ruminating, when you're doing these small grazes, you can really time it and play around with it and just observe for what works and what works for you and what works for your cows. And with these small grazes, you can time it to where they have impacted it, grazed it, and trampled it in a non-selective manner. Yet they're satiated. They're laying down, ruminating, or they're just like bored, picking around, And you can show up and move them, and that competitive instinct would make them want to move them when they're full. And they want to get to that grass before the other cow does. And so you're basically force feeding your cows. They're choosing to eat when they otherwise wouldn't had you have not moved them. And Johann Zeitzman calls that high relative intake. He says that there's a genetic component to high relative intake. So the amount of feed that a cow can eat in relation to her body size has an effect on her body condition. And body condition is everything in a model like this where it's grass-based. I believe you can also influence high relative intake through management by moving your cows when they're full. That's how we've increased body condition over the winter on our cows, is moving them when they're full. And it's also taken that competitive instinct that's very stressful, and it's taken it we've turned it and used it to our advantage, and it's taken it away from as a negative component to mob grazing for us. This third bullet point, this really had to get hammered into my head. I had to learn this lesson a lot. I cost the ranch a lot of money. It's like once you start having successes in kind of this lower input scenario, you get really, get really protective of our resources, and it's like, we don't need to feed our cows. We'll just see how bad the storm is. And then by the time it's like, the storm's pretty bad, we should probably feed our cows, it's way too late. The damage has been done, and then you have to play catch up after that. And what you just did to burn that body condition and those calories, very expensive to get it back if you can get it back. And so if a storm's coming, we feed on the front end of a storm. And usually you end up feeding less by doing that. Your cows stay satiated. It totally takes the edge off of what's happening. That's been really big for us. Low stress livestock handling. We've been big followers of Bud Williams and his principles and his techniques for a couple decades. And having the cows trust us and look to us for leadership is really what makes this possible. I can't stress that enough. And then adequate fresh water always in this type of a model is a necessity. You hear people whose cows can just eat snow and be fine. Not us. Not in our scenario. I've killed cows doing that. We had 3 cows die once because the snow was wet. They weren't going. Cows are lazy. If they think that they can get by, they won't go to water. And so we thought they were fine because we noticed they weren't going to water. We thought they were fine because they weren't taking themselves to water. It's like, oh, they must be all right. We had 3 cows die. And the reason I know that they died from dehydration was because I post-opted them and cut open their abomasum, and it was just dry, compacted feed. So fresh water at all times is very crucial, because otherwise they're just filled with all this dry organic matter that we've been force feeding them with, right? They need that water to help that's one of the, if not the foundation of a good digestive system. And then from an ecological standpoint, ecological grazing principles that we adhere to, non-selective grazing when feasible. It's not always feasible. So we're moving our cows every day in the winter. That's not what we do year-round. We have some Forest Service ground that yearlings go to, and they'll be in a pasture for 6 weeks, just because it's not feasible to do anything beyond that. But in those pastures, we adhere to the Gus Hormet rest rotation system. Anyway, non-selective grazing when feasible, followed by long periods of rest, which for us is at least a year. Sometimes if we graze a pasture in March, which is in the dormant season for us still, we can go back the next January and graze it again because it wasn't grazed during the growing season. So this 1-2 punch of non-selective grazing followed by a long period of rest, what it does is you're covering and building soil through your trampling effect. You're selecting for your desirable species. You're lengthening your growing season by covering the soil and moderating the temperature, and also selecting for those desirable species that then hold their green for longer. You increase your harvest efficiency. So if you're to go from selective grazing to non-selective grazing, immediately you'll have at least 30% more grass just from a higher harvest rate. You increase your forage productivity. We're capturing more water. We're capturing more energy. All of this, which equates to an increased stocking rate, which is one of the things that we need to do to build resiliency into our system to hopefully bring it to the 6th generation. So how are we doing it? Technically speaking, well, we enlist a lot of help. We get a lot of help. No, this probably isn't foreign to anyone here in this room, but we use polywire, and a lot of it. In our favorite brand, we have a lot of wildlife. There's a herd of elk there are 4,500 elk in the area, and usually they aren't a problem until the rut happens. And then we get them going through our polywire all the time. And the best luck that we've had is this Gallagher turbo wire. We've had some of this stuff for 20 years, and it continues to do a good job. And this is a electric reel that we built that we put on the back of our side-by-sides. We don't do much of the hand crank stuff. We do too much polywire. Anytime, like at any given point in the summer, we might have 14 miles of polywire out. This is the posts that we prefer. They're these 3/8" fiberglass posts. Most of what we have is native range. It's rocky. Those step-in posts just do not work for us, especially when it's frozen. These posts are very practical. You can put a lot on a four-wheeler. They go in, most of the year you can just push them in, and when it's frozen or rocky, we got you take a cap. All of us have caps in our pockets, and you just tap it in with fence pliers or a hammer. And so what we'll do, we'll set up, this is what we'd call a break fence. So ungrazed on the left, grazed on the right. Water would be off on the right someplace, and we just roll up this fence to give them access for their day's ration. Here's another photo. Here's a brake fence. We roll it up. It looks like there's a fence on the left. There isn't. That's just the fence that we rolled up to give access for that day's feed. And in non-selective grazing, you graze in such a high density that most of the ground is pretty soiled. It's pretty fouled, that there isn't much backpicking. When they go back to water, they go back to water. And then they come back and they go back to feeding, to grazing. This is what it looks like from a distance. So water would be way off on the left, and they just trail out. We don't really do pie-shaped. It's usually squares or rectangles. It seems to work best for us. Again, here's another photo. Looks like there's a fence on the right. That's just where we rolled up our polywire. And then in this photo, the water would be on the backside of that rocky reef that they'd be trailing to. So what about labor? That sounds like a lot of work. And I don't want to sugarcoat it. It is a lot of work. And you have to be disciplined, and you have to show up every single day and put in the effort and do the job. But it's just a transition of work that you're already doing. You're just pivoting. And for those of us who actually enjoy our cows, enjoy grass, and enjoy seeing the benefits of our efforts, it can be incredibly rewarding. And as far as time spent doing the same job, if you were to go out and feed our cows in a tractor, it'd take you, if they're right next to a stack yard, it'd take you 4 hours. Usually take you at least 6. Or you could go out with a polywire and feed them and be done in 2 hours easy. So it is more efficient use of the time. And in non-selective grazing, it immediately gives you 30% more grass. And then, so summer grazing, what most of our summer looks like, the most drastic example of the other end of the spectrum I gave you with our Forest Service permit. Most of our mob, we're grazing out. You know, there will be anywhere from 1,000 to 1,400 pairs in a group, and depending on where they are in their cycle, whether they're calving, what the terrain is, our paddocks will vary between 65 acres and 400 acres. So about seven pairs to the acre, and we're moving every 2 to 10 days, again, depending on where they are in their cycle and the terrain. And we try to make every event, we try to make a non-selective grazing event when feasible and when it makes sense. And just by doing that, we've increased our forage harvest and production rate by 110%. This photo is just to show how, you know, we have a lot of terrain in our summer country, and we take advantage of the terrain with where we route our polywire to manipulate cow behavior and to utilize the terrain and get these grazing goals that we need, so that we're using as little polywire as possible and putting in as little effort as possible to get the goals and outcomes that we'd like. So that red line in the distance just shows where we routed a polywire, and we just treated out up top and we brought it down to the bottom, and where they actually are in the foreground is part of the same permanent pasture. So it's this huge pasture, but that allowed us to get this small little graze. We also routed up that creek bottom to where it was just kind of this triangle. Here's another photo of what we could do with terrain, to use terrain to our advantage, just treeing it out or rocking out. And it's not perfect. Some cows are going to go around the polywire, but we really can focus a lot of the impact and the behavior in areas that we want. One thing that became glaringly obvious once we changed our grazing management was our grazing had way outpaced our genetics. That in order to graze in this way that we understood was the way that we needed to graze to move towards our end goal, we needed a different type of cow to do it. And I think Johann Zeitzman sums it up best in that a cow has a dual purpose role. One, to improve the ground she's grazing on, and two, to efficiently convert grass into beef while doing it. And so if you fully understand both of those, that takes a unique cow that's not common anymore. a cow that can graze non-selectively and convert that grass efficiently into beef while putting on fat, a layer of fat and body condition, that's a tall order. Those genetics are hard to find. And so we started selecting our own bulls to take advantage of cows that did do that and cows that thrived in our system and our environment. And by environment, a big part of our environment is our management. And so we came up with a two-pronged approach in order to select bulls. First one being we select bulls from our age cows, 6 years old and up. And they have to, the criteria is that we select them in their first cycle. So they have to calve in their first cycle. The cow has to be a body condition 6 or better, moderate frame, good udder, good feet, good mothering instinct. Don't care what the calf looks like. If it's a bull calf, he gets a tag in his left ear and he stays intact at branding. Prong number 2, this is the most difficult one to describe. So we have our 2-year-olds, our first calf heifers. They start calving like May 28th. So our 2-year-olds are calving May 28th. The bull battery normally goes out August 17th. But we'll go in with a bull or bulls of our choosing June 25th. And they'll be in for 30 days. And then we pull those bulls, and then the rest of the bull battery doesn't go out until August 17th. And so what happens in that scenario are the heifers, since we're a commercial herd, we don't have any records, we don't know who's doing what, but the heifers that are the elite of the elite, the most fertile girls in that peer group, will breed to those bulls in July. And then they'll calve in April, and we'll know that they're out of that bull. We'll know that they're out of our most fertile genetics. Those calves stay intact. And then we take those genetics and we cast them out over the rest of our herd once they become bulls. So through that two-pronged approach, we started selecting for our own genetics 7 years ago. And our bull selection criteria, we don't grow them out anything special. We run them with the rest of our calves, so we wean in early November when they're 5 months old. We fence line wean. Every time that we're moving our cows in the winter, they're going by the handler in the gate. We're preparing them to fence line wean the following November. And it is a non-event. So these calves get weaned. Our bull calves get wintered with our steer calves. It averages about 12 pounds of hay per head, 2 pounds of cake. And then once they're yearlings, so the following late April, early May, 11 months old, we'll bring them in and we'll take individual weights, we'll take individual hip heights, and we'll measure how many pounds per vertical inch of animal there is individually. And that's pounds of meat, that's a meat to bone ratio. That's how many pounds per vertical inch, so that's like the small, stocky bulls. That has a high propensity or a high correlation with early sexual maturity, which is fertility, which has a high correlation with body condition. And in this type of a system, body condition is everything. Fertility, calf health, milking ability, longevity. Everything that's important to us in this type of model boils down to body condition. That's our number one. We're also measuring scrotals and disposition, but that's our number one criteria. And then there's this chart from University of Missouri where you can project from their individual hip height at that certain age. You can project what their mature weight is, and then you can calculate what percentage of their mature weight that they are. And then you can rate them for who is the earliest maturing bull. And when I buy outside bulls, that's a metric that I use. And it is the most accurate metric I've found to predict how those bulls are going to grow out. All of that's from Johann Zeitzman. And lo and behold, this wasn't the intention. It's turned into its own enterprise. We're selling bulls now, commercial bulls. These are 10 bulls we sold to a producer who is following what we're doing and is a believer in our type of genetics. So all of this is happening on top of, we've been running composites and buying composite bulls for 16 years now. So this is a photo of a black composite bull from Iowa. Radokovich Cattle Company is where we get our outside composite bulls. And I'm a big believer in the science behind composites. The science came out in the 1980s from Meat Animal Research Center in Clay Center, Kansas, I believe, or Nebraska. I know there's two Clay Centers. I always get them confused. But basically, the word composite gets thrown around fairly liberally. Anything from half-blood to a 1/32 blood is called a composite. That's not a true composite. A true composite, ideally, is 5 or more breeds within one hide. And so what happens when you do that is you capture heterosis effect. So if you have a F1 cross, so a black Angus and a Hereford, they have 100% heterosis effect, that hybrid vigor that you hear about, which an economist out of Kansas State equated to if you have a cow that has 100% heterosis effect, she brings you unseen income to the tune of about $200 a year annually through longevity, milking ability, better conversion of forage into beef. They're about 30% more efficient in their use of forage, fertility, on and on. Everything's just like enhanced a little bit. But once that F1 cross cow has a calf, its calf only has 50% heterosis. And that heterosis is diluted by half with each subsequent generation. And so in order to capture that, it gets to be a pretty convoluted, complex breeding scenario. So the beauty behind composites, once you've got 5 breeds and up, is you have an 83 to 88% heterosis effect that doesn't get diluted from one generation to the next. It's there. You've got it. And the other benefit to composites is you can mix and match breeds to get exactly what you need for your environment. I'm of the belief that there isn't one perfect breed. Don't want to step on anybody's toes. And every environment's different. And that there's a way that you can mix and match breeds to really come up with something that might be a better fit for your own environment. And so we started developing our own composite. And so phase 1 was bringing in an outside breed and putting it on top of the composites that we'd already been breeding to for the last at that time it would have been 9 years. And that outside breed was an Obrock. And then phase 2 would be stacking composites. So the other thing behind the science of composites is it's counterintuitive, because you think you've got all these breeds that your calf crop would have a wide variability in like how their traits are expressed. It actually takes that variability curve and it tightens it. You have less variation in your calf crop in a composite herd than you do in a purebred herd. That's from the science out of Meat Animal Research Center. And so phase 2 is stacking composites, so taking these composites we've been breeding into phase 1 and putting them on top of the composites that we already had and compounding that heterosis effect, compounding those composites and tightening that variability curve, and that's where we are currently. And from what we've seen, it certainly seems to be true. There's less variation in our calves. Phase 3 will be another outside breed, and then we'd continue on. So phase 1, Obrock. This is an Obrock bull called Double Up. He's from a breeder in Hot Springs, Montana. Obrock is a breed from South Central France, so they're a continental breed. They're moderate. They're no bigger than a frame score 5. They're highly fertile. They have low milk but high butter fat, high body condition, very good mothering instinct. So I'd heard about this breed. I'd never been around them, and I went to a breeder in central Montana who had a herd of Obrocks and a herd of Black Angus, low input Black Angus, same type of lines that we'd been pulling from before we went to composites. And they were run under the same management. My dad and I went down there after they'd weaned. And it was a tough year in that part of the state. And the Black Angus cows were at best a body condition 4.5, at best. And the Obrock cows were at worst a body condition 6. Same management. The only difference was genetics. And that body condition is, man, if you've got a cow, like in a storm yesterday, that's a body condition 4.5 versus a body condition 6, you can, if you have that body condition 6 cow, you can breathe so much more easy. And she takes so much less calories to maintain. You've got so much more wiggle room. There's room for mistakes. When you have a cow that's body condition 4, 4.5, you're walking a tight line. So anyway, he had a herd sire that he was going to retire and haul into town and sell at the auction, so I offered to buy him, and we put him in early on our calving first calf heifers, and we got six calves out of him. That was the first year we did that. I've been asked, have you actually been improving fertility? And there isn't really any way that we can measure that aside from breed back, and there's so many variables at play. Our breed back has been increasing, but that first year we did it, we had 4% take to the early bulls. In the last 3 years, it's been 36% every year. So we've gone from 4% to 36%. So I would argue that our herd fertility has been increasing. This is one of the sons. This is a half-blood Obrock bull that was out of that putting him in early program. Now he's been put in early on the 2-year-olds. This is a yearling bull. And this is his sister, is a 2-year-old. This is a better photo here. That's a 2-year-old heifer who hasn't had any special care. Look how fat she is. That's exactly what we're going for. It's pretty incredible. So that's phase 1. Phase 2 is stacking composite on top of composite. I just took this photo on Saturday. This is a 8-month-old bull calf. This is the result of stacking a composite on top of a composite. I've been really wanting to get my hands on what's called Drakensberger. They're this breed from the Drakensberg Mountains of South Africa, where it's cold and it snows. It's about as much of an outcross as you can get. They're black. For us, that's important. And there's finally going to be some Drakensberger semen coming into the States this year, so we're probably going to AI to some Drakensberger bulls and start phase 3. And so how to increase stocking rate through genetics. One way to do it is through composites. One, through the bleed complementarity component of mixing and matching breeds. So the reason we chose a Obrock, and the reason I wanted to go look at that herd was I basically did a balance sheet of our strengths and weaknesses as a cow herd. And the Obrock addressed all of our weaknesses: udder quality, hindquarters, mothering ability, and moderate frame. So mixing and matching breeds, and then a benefit to that is the heterosis. Cow size, if you were to go from a 1,400-pound cow to an 1,100-pound cow, you can immediately run 30% more cows. And selecting for functional genetics, so genetic resiliency, which is, as I mentioned, body condition is everything. That'd be early sexual maturity, which is your fertility, be hormonal balance, and be high relative intake. And we're also very sensitive to what the end product is, what's going to consumers. And we track that on 2 fronts. We sell some grass-fed beef in the state, and this is a steak. This is a grass-fed beef steak from one of our critters, harvested in the winter. And we also retain ownership on a bunch of our yearlings through a cooperative, and they go to a feedlot, and we track all their performance in the feedlot. We get all their carcass traits back, and they have EID tags, so I can identify who's who. And the composites that we've been raising are outperforming our other composites in the feedlot. So it's just a super functional direction that we're going that's moving everything positive, in a positive direction. And so for us, marrying these functional genetics with non-selective grazing and good on-the-ground observation has created a win-win-win. We've increased our productivity. We're essentially creating more life We've increased our stocking rate, which has increased our ability to generate revenue. So that's financial. And we've been empowering our people and providing a sense of purpose for all of us. It's been just an absolutely thrilling, difficult, trying, challenging, rewarding journey that we've been on. And then the monitoring results that we've seen from our grazing, we have a third-party monitor come in and read Transex. And in our winter zone, the most drastic change that we've seen, which happened in 5 years, was one of the Transex went from 26% bare soil down to 2% bare soil. And the average of those Transex went from 8% bare soil down to 0%. Our plant species composition has also been trending positive towards desirables. Japanese brome, cheatgrass have been declining rapidly. And in this last year, that monitoring service started doing Haney soil health tests. And they did 4 samples in our winter zone where we've had our most intensive grazing. And they said that they've sampled around 20 or more than 20 ranches in the West, and ours were by far the highest that they'd seen. Our average for the soil organic matter was 10.5%. It ranged from 7 to 16.5%, whereas the average of the other ranches did not go above 5% and was below 4 to 5%. And soil respiration, which is basically a metric to see how much microbial life there might be in the soil. It measures carbon released in the soil. Our average was 174 parts per million carbon, whereas other ranches did not get above 100. And one thing that we've been doing, which has been pretty neat, is we've been hosting some winter grazing workshops, because I've been going around and giving talks like this and people get pretty revved up and amped, but I don't think many people really went home and made changes. And so we started hosting some winter grazing workshops on the ranch to just take the mystique out of it and show that if you really want to do this, you can do it. If we're doing it, anyone can do it. And just to give you the tools to do so, because it's taken us 20 years to get to this point, and we would love to help other people along. And one big win for me personally that I'm very proud of is there's 50 government agency personnel that showed up to one of the workshops last year. BLM, Forest Service, Soil Conservation District, NRCS, FWP. So people are interested. And to me, that's awesome. That's what we need. Another focus of ours is putting in infrastructure to help facilitate this type of grazing. And we put in one water project that cost 50 grand, and last year was the first year that we used it, and it bought us basically 3 weeks worth of grass for our mob, which equated to about 28 grand worth of grass. And so we got an ROI of 56% on that. Had we not been grazing and keeping records of the type of grazing that we were doing, we wouldn't have known how to monetize that or what type of an ROI that we could get. And it doesn't look like it, but there's 1,300 cows up in the bowl of that mountain range right there. And so, in summary, my take, anyways, on managing grasslands into the future, one of a possible potential way to do it would be to non-selectively graze when feasible, follow that with long periods of rest, and get functional genetics on the ground. And by doing that, you'd be building soil, you'd be increasing your harvest rate and forage productivity, your stocking rate, your revenue potential, and hopefully in the process, you'd be empowering the people involved. And by doing so, we're keeping people on the land. I'm not one of these guys that thinks that you should have one person per every 1,000 cows. I think the more people we can have on the ground, the better. And this is one of my coworkers, Dave, who manages the mob. He claims that he's changing the world one bite at a time. And just to bring it full circle, that's my daughter and myself on the right. And then on the left, those are other members of the 6th generation. And one thing, that's my Uncle Whit. He's cooking steaks on the fire. He heats up these rocks where they get really hot, and then he slaps these steaks on the fire, and once they fall off into the coals, they're medium rare, and it works perfectly. So one thing that we've done, because the sixth generation spread across the state, is a question that we've put to ourselves is how do we create this emotional, spiritual connection with this between the sixth generation and the ranch, to where the ranch is inviolate. You can't, most important thing in their lives. And we started doing a ranch camp every summer to just bring these kids onto the ranch and let them be ranch kids, get their hands dirty, learn how to gut a fish, cook steaks by a fire. And that's one of the things that we're trying to do, to create this connection, to instill the importance of this place in the sixth generation. And for me, that's why all the hard work is worth it. So, thank you.
Cooper, one question for Cooper. We're going to bring him back, obviously. Dave, we'll let you answer or ask.
Great talk. Thank you very much. One question I have from something that we see here is Canada thistle and some other unwanted weeds. Do you have any of those, and what effects do you see when you do the non-selective grazing? Do those actually get grazed? And then when you rest, do you see them come back kind of with a vengeance, or any word on that?
They definitely don't come back with a vengeance. First part of your question, yes, we certainly have weeds. Non-selective grazing, I mean, in the winter, we can't really, the weeds aren't very visible. In the summer, lots of the times they do get grazed, sometimes they don't get touched. It depends on where that plant is in its cycle. That, you know, they'll get trampled, maybe if we're running at high enough density, which for us is sometimes hard up in the mountains. But they aren't expanding, and then sometimes, like that photo I shared, sometimes they are diminishing. I wouldn't say it's a tool to eradicate weeds, from what I've seen. Yeah.
One more question, quick. Fritz?
Yes, with all your paddocks you get out, you said 150?
Yes.
How do you get water to all of them? I mean, do you pipe it, or do you have dams in places, or what? I mean, that's a lot of paddocks out there for.
Yeah, thank you. I didn't explain that very well. So you remember that photo of when the cows were on the side hill and they're marching away from water and water was out of the picture?
Right.
So we'll call that like a backbone fence. And one of those can last 7 to 10 days where we're marching away from water. And then we'll go to the next laneway up and we'll start closer to water, and then we'll march away from water. And then we'll go again and we'll march away from water. So we've had our cows walk as far as 2 miles to water, which is not ideal. Once we get to 3/4 of a mile, it becomes more difficult.
Okay, when you're doing that, is it the same water that you're walking?
Same water, yep. Same water point. We've gotten creative with laneways, and there's a number of things that you can do to make that happen. But there also gets to a point where you can't do it. You get too far away from water.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Cooper.